Welcome to my channel. Subscribe, listen and enjoy my stories every day. It was just another Friday morning. Alicia was stirring her coffee, scrolling through her phone with that look of distracted concentration I'd come to know all too well. I didn't give it much thought until she put her mug down and looked at me, an odd glint in her eyes. "I'll be out tonight," she announced. "Going out with friends. I probably won't be back until tomorrow afternoon." I stared at her, the casual way she'd tossed the words out there. 15 years of marriage, and this was how she was delivering the news that she'd be out for the night. Her tone was too rehearsed, the kind of polished delivery you might expect from a practiced speaker, not from the person I'd built a life with. I tried to act unfazed. "Out with friends, huh?" I asked, forcing a smile. Alicia looked up, almost startled, as if she hadn't expected me to respond. She regained her composure, brushing a few loose strands of hair behind her ear, then nodded. "Yeah, just a night out. It's been a long week at work," she said, barely meeting my eyes. She didn't offer any more details, and I didn't press. I couldn't explain why, but something about her delivery left me uneasy. Alicia and I had been together long enough that I'd come to recognize the tells. I had that sixth sense about her, the way people do when they've spent years together. And right then, every alarm bell in my mind was blaring. But still, I swallowed it down. Maybe I was overreacting. After all, everyone deserves a night out. When she left, I watched her go, feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in our marriage. I told myself that she was just tired, that she needed a break. But that didn't make the growing pit of dread in my stomach any smaller. All day, I tried to go about my routine, pushing away the thoughts that kept creeping in, but it was impossible to ignore the questions swirling in my mind. Why hadn't she said who she was going out with? Why had she looked so detached? As the hours passed, the pit in my stomach grew into something I couldn't ignore. I went into the bedroom and found her laptop. It was a cheap move, maybe even a betrayal in itself, but at that point, I needed answers. I'd long known her password, we'd shared everything for years. A quick search through her emails showed nothing obvious, so I turned to her phone records. I'd almost given up, telling myself I was just being paranoid, when I spotted a new number popping up again and again. My stomach tightened as I recognized the pattern. The number was unfamiliar, but the frequency and timing of the messages were unmistakable. Late nights, early mornings, at hours no normal friend would be texting. I stared at the screen, feeling the weight of what I was seeing. Each new call, each late-night text, was like a new wound, adding to the gnawing pain in my gut. I put her phone down, my heart racing. A name floated in the back of my mind, a name I hadn't heard her mention but that I'd overheard in passing. Darren. It had come up once or twice in casual conversations she'd had on the phone, quick, offhand mentions. I'd never thought much of it then, but now, seeing the same number pop up again and again, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was the man she was out with. As evening rolled around, I felt trapped in a cloud of my own thoughts, caught between anger and disbelief. How had I missed this? I replayed scenes from our marriage over and over, questioning everything, every little thing she'd ever said or done. A dark voice in the back of my mind urged me to follow her, to see for myself if what I was suspecting was true. But I couldn't bring myself to do it, not yet. I didn't have the proof, just the pit in my stomach and a nagging feeling that had been gnawing at me for weeks. So I waited. I sat by the window in our darkened living room, a glass of bourbon in hand, watching the clock tick slowly. Midnight came and went, then 1 o'clock, then 2. Every hour felt like an eternity. With every passing minute, the reality of it settled in deeper. She wasn't coming back tonight. And the hollow feeling I'd been fighting off all day finally took hold, wrapping itself around me like a cold, suffocating blanket. By dawn, she still wasn't home. I lay in bed, listening to the silence of the house, my mind running in circles. Every memory, every laugh, every shared glance now felt tainted. What we'd built together seemed like a beautiful lie, something that had slowly withered in the shadows while I had been blissfully unaware. The woman I thought I knew was a stranger. Around 8 that morning, I finally heard the front door open. I listened to the soft, hesitant sound of her footsteps as she moved through the house. I didn't get up to greet her. I didn't want to see the face of someone who could betray me like that. She slipped quietly into bed beside me, her weight sinking into the mattress, and I lay there pretending to sleep, trying to stop the torrent of emotions that threatened to spill over. Later that day, she acted as if nothing had happened. She moved around the kitchen making breakfast, her face a perfect mask of calm. Watching her there, so composed, I felt a sick, twisted satisfaction. If this was a game, I was ready to play. She thought she was getting away with it, that I was oblivious, and a plan began to take shape in my mind. The rest of that day, I went about my business as if nothing had changed. But every smile, every casual touch she offered, felt like poison. By the time evening came, I was resolute. If Alicia wanted to play games, I'd let her. But this time, I'd be the one calling the shots. In the days that followed, I found myself slipping into a kind of autopilot, holding together the facade that everything was normal. Alicia continued her routines, going to work, coming home, glancing at her phone with that little smile I now knew was meant for someone else. The details of my life felt wrong, almost surreal. The house, once a place of warmth and comfort, now felt like a trap. Every room seemed filled with fragments of the life I thought we'd built together, memories that now felt twisted, tainted. I didn't confront her. Instead, I waited and watched. Her behavior stayed mostly the same, but there were subtle differences. She'd dress up a bit more, a new shade of lipstick, a hint of perfume she hadn't worn before. It all added up, each detail another stitch in the web of betrayal she'd woven around us. And Darren, the name haunted me, filling my mind with images of a faceless man I'd never met but whom I'd come to despise. I took my anger and focused it, directing it toward a plan that had been forming since that morning she'd come back and slid into bed without a word. I needed proof, something undeniable, something that would show her that I wasn't the fool she thought I was. I began with small steps, checking her phone again when I could, piecing together snippets of her life that she was so carefully hiding from me. There were messages between them, coded but unmistakably flirtatious. Then, the time-stamped photos he'd sent her of city streets and coffee shops, places he'd suggested they meet. It was on a Friday evening, a week later, that I put the next part of my plan into motion. Alicia was supposed to be at a work function. She'd left the house earlier that evening, dressed impeccably, hair swept back in a way I knew she reserved for special occasions. As she stepped out, she didn't look back, her confidence a painful reminder that she believed she had me completely fooled. After giving her enough time to settle into her plans, I decided to follow her. Her phone's tracking feature was still synced with mine. It was a small betrayal of privacy, but in light of what I suspected, it felt justified. I watched the dot representing her location as it moved across town, finally settling at a small bar downtown. I knew it, a place with dim lighting and cozy booths, perfect for an intimate, hidden-away meeting. I sat in my car outside, watching the entrance from across the street. Through the darkened windows, I could make out people chatting, laughing, enjoying their Friday night. My heart raced as I scanned the crowd for her familiar figure, the blonde hair she wore pinned up, her posture relaxed and confident. A few minutes later, I spotted her. She wasn't alone. She was sitting across from a man who looked to be around my age, his hair neatly styled, his arm resting casually along the back of their booth. There it was, right before my eyes. Any lingering doubts I might have clung to evaporated. She was leaning in close to him, her laughter light and carefree in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. He was everything I wasn't in that moment, someone who could make her smile like that, someone who held her attention in a way I'd lost. I watched them for what felt like hours, every laugh, every glance between them driving a knife deeper into the wound. I don't remember leaving the bar, only that I ended up back in my car, parked in a nearby lot, the city lights blurring through my windshield. The rage simmered under the surface, controlled but potent. I knew that marching into that bar, confronting her then and there, would be a disaster. There was no satisfaction in a public scene, no real revenge in shouting out the truth to a crowd of strangers. No, I wanted something more, a way to make her understand what she'd thrown away, to make her feel every ounce of pain she'd inflicted. When I finally pulled myself together, I drove home, letting the details of my plan come into sharper focus. By the time Alicia walked through the door later that night, I was back in our bedroom, pretending to be asleep. She slipped quietly into bed, her movements careful as if she feared waking me. The irony of her caution stung, but I kept my breathing steady, letting her believe her lie was safe, at least for one more night. The next morning, I waited until she left the house for her Saturday yoga class before I went into action. I started with her closet, packing away every little memento of our shared life, each reminder of the woman I thought she was. I emptied the drawers, taking down photos of us from the walls, removing every trace of her from the spaces we'd once shared. As I worked, a calm settled over me. This was my way of taking control back, of showing her that I wasn't the clueless husband she thought she'd fooled. When she came home later that morning, the house was almost bare. I'd piled her belongings in the guest room, out of sight, as if I could physically push her betrayal into another part of the house. She noticed the changes immediately, her face going pale as she looked around, taking in the empty spaces, the missing photos, the cleared shelves. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice shaky. I looked at her, letting the silence stretch out until she shifted uncomfortably. "I think we need to talk," I said, my voice calm. The shock in her eyes was unmistakable, but she tried to regain control, her face slipping into the mask she'd worn so well. "What about?" she asked, feigning innocence. "Don't," I said, my voice harsher than I'd intended. I took a breath, reining in the anger that threatened to spill over. "Don't pretend you don't know. I know about Darren. I know everything." Her face went blank, the color draining as she struggled to respond. The silence hung heavy between us, broken only by her shallow breaths. For a moment, I almost felt pity. But that was quickly overtaken by the resolve I'd built up over these long, sleepless nights. I'd prepared myself for this moment, rehearsed it over and over in my mind. I wouldn't be swayed by her excuses or her tears. "You don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice wavered, and I could see the panic flickering in her eyes. The calm I felt only grew. I had her exactly where I wanted her, and there was no turning back now. "Then explain the late-night texts," I said, stepping closer. "Explain the weekend work trips. Explain the dates with him at that bar downtown." She opened her mouth, but no words came. Her gaze dropped to the floor, and I knew I'd broken through the final layer of her deception. "Why?" I demanded, my voice breaking despite my best efforts to stay composed. "Why would you do this to us? To me?" Alicia's shoulders sagged, her defenses crumbling. She didn't have an answer, or at least not one she was willing to admit. She looked up, her face a mix of guilt and defiance. I never meant for you to find out," she whispered. I laughed, a bitter sound that echoed through the empty room. "Is that supposed to make me feel better?" I asked, shaking my head. "You were willing to throw everything away, for what?" "For him." She didn't answer, and in that silence, I felt the final break, the last thread of connection between us snapping. In that moment, I knew that I didn't want revenge. Not in the way I'd originally thought. I wanted something deeper, something lasting. I wanted her to feel the emptiness, the loss, to live with the consequences of her choices. And I knew exactly how I was going to make that happen. I turned, leaving her standing in the middle of the room, the shell of our life around her. As I walked out, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. I'd finally regained control, and now it was my turn to watch as she unraveled. The first few days after the confrontation were silent, thick with tension. Alicia moved around the house cautiously, watching me as though I might snap at any moment. But I stayed calm, indifferent even, letting her feel the weight of her decisions. She tried several times to start a conversation, to explain herself, but each time I cut her off with a cold stare that said all I needed to say. This wasn't going to be the kind of betrayal she could simply brush away with excuses and apologies. Late one evening, she finally gathered the nerve to approach me. I was sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the television, not really watching. She stood in the doorway for a moment, hesitant, and then spoke. "I know I've hurt you," she said quietly. Her voice was steady, but there was a hint of desperation. "But don't you think we can try to work through this?" "Work through this?" I repeated, not bothering to mask the bitterness in my voice. "What exactly do you think we're working toward, Alicia? You lied to me. You betrayed me. Do you honestly believe there's a way back from that?" She looked away, wringing her hands. "People make mistakes, John. Marriages survive worse." "Worse?" I shook my head, unable to believe the words coming out of her mouth. "You destroyed the trust we built over 15 years. You built a life with me, shared a home, and the whole time you were lying. Sneaking around with him. Tell me, is that the kind of mistake you think people just work through?" Alicia's face twisted, torn between anger and regret. "I never meant for it to go this far," she said, her voice trembling. It just happened. I didn't want to hurt you." I laughed, a bitter sound that cut through her excuse. "So you're telling me you didn't mean for this to happen?" I asked, barely able to hold back my anger. "Every late-night text, every lie, every time you came home and pretended everything was normal, that just happened." She fell silent, her gaze dropping to the floor. I felt a twinge of satisfaction at her silence. For once, she didn't have an excuse, no words to hide behind. And for the first time since that morning, I felt I was finally getting through to her, breaking down her defenses. "John, please," she whispered. "I know I've hurt you, and I don't deserve forgiveness. But I still love you. Can't we find a way to start over?" Her words hung in the air, and I could see the desperation in her eyes, the raw fear of losing everything. For a moment, I almost softened. I remembered all the years we'd spent together, the memories, the laughter, the life we'd built side by side. But then I thought of Darren, of every lie she'd told me, and my resolve hardened. "I'm not interested in starting over," I said, my voice cold and final. "You made your choice, Alicia. You made it the moment you decided to betray me." I could see the impact of my words, the way they hit her like a blow. She stood there, a mix of anger and sadness flashing across her face. I could tell she wanted to argue, to plead, but there was nothing left for her to say. She turned and walked away, and I watched her go, feeling an odd sense of satisfaction. She was finally beginning to understand the gravity of what she'd done, the reality of what she'd lost. As the days passed, Alicia's attempts to speak with me became less frequent. She was retreating, slipping into herself, and the silence between us grew colder, thicker. The house, once filled with laughter and warmth, felt like an empty shell, haunted by the echoes of what we'd lost. Each evening I'd sit in the same chair, staring out the window, feeling the weight of our fractured life settle over me. One evening, I decided it was time for the next phase of my plan. I wanted her to experience the emptiness she'd left me with, to feel the hollowness that came with betrayal. So I began making small changes around the house, moving my belongings into the guest room, removing my clothes from our shared closet. I stopped coming home for dinner, spending evenings out with friends or taking long drives. I didn't tell her where I was going, didn't offer any explanations. She would ask, her voice tentative, but I'd brush her off with a vague answer. I could see the impact it had on her. She would wait up, watching the clock as the hours passed, her worry and frustration mounting. She was used to controlling the narrative, to having me as the constant, reliable partner who'd always be there. Now, that stability was slipping away, and I could see it rattling her, breaking down the walls she'd carefully built around herself. One evening, I returned home late, well after midnight. Alicia was waiting, pacing in the living room, her face drawn with tension. As soon as I walked in, she turned to me, anger flashing in her eyes. "Where have you been?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "Out," I replied casually, not bothering to explain further. "Out? You've been coming home late every night, barely speaking to me, acting like I don't even exist." She took a step closer, her voice rising. "This isn't fair, John. I made a mistake, but I'm still your wife. I deserve to know where you're going." "You don't deserve anything from me," I said, my voice cold. "You lost that right the moment you decided Darren was worth more than our marriage." Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I saw a glimpse of the woman I'd fallen in love with. Vulnerable, hurt, reaching out for something familiar, something real. But I refused to let my resolve waver. I knew that if I softened, if I allowed myself to feel anything for her, it would give her a way back in, a chance to explain away the betrayal. And I couldn't let that happen. "You're pushing me away," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You're punishing me, and I get it. But what's the end game here, John? Are you trying to make me leave? Is that it?" I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "You don't get it, Alicia. This isn't about pushing you away. It's about making you understand what you've done. You destroyed the life we built together, and now you're finally feeling the consequences." She stared at me, the tears in her eyes shining in the dim light. "I can't undo what's happened," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "But I thought we could find a way to rebuild. To try and fix this." "There's nothing left to fix," I replied, my tone unwavering. "You burned it all down, Alicia. Now, you'll have to live with the ashes." With that, I turned and walked upstairs, leaving her standing there, a broken figure in the middle of our hollow home. I knew that this was what I wanted, that watching her suffer, watching her come to terms with the devastation she'd caused, was the closest I'd come to finding any kind of closure. But as I lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, a strange emptiness settled over me, an aching loneliness that even revenge couldn't fill. In the quiet hours before dawn, I wondered if perhaps, in trying to make her feel the pain she'd inflicted, I was only deepening my own wounds. But it was too late to turn back now. We'd both crossed a line, and there was no way to undo what had been done. This was the life she had chosen, and now, I was bound to it just as much as she was. In the darkness, I closed my eyes, trying to silence the questions, the doubts, the small, persistent voice that whispered of a different path, one where forgiveness might have been possible. But I pushed it aside, hardening myself once more. I couldn't afford to be weak. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. The house was silent, steeped in the bitterness of broken trust, of shattered dreams. And as the first light of dawn crept through the windows, I knew that the days ahead would be filled with more silence, more tension, and the slow, steady unraveling of everything we'd once been. In the weeks that followed, the tension between Alicia and me transformed from simmering resentment into something heavier, more oppressive. The days passed like a silent war, each of us walking on eggshells, unable to find the peace we'd once taken for granted. I kept up the cold facade, determined not to let her forget what she'd done. I saw the strain in her eyes, the way her shoulders slumped as if carrying the weight of her own guilt. She looked more fragile than I'd ever seen her, a ghost of the woman I'd married. But despite everything, I couldn't shake the hollow ache that had settled in my chest. I told myself it was part of the process, part of the closure I needed, but each time I left the house to avoid her, each night I lay awake staring at the empty side of the bed, that ache grew sharper, deeper. The satisfaction I'd once felt was waning, replaced by a kind of loneliness I hadn't anticipated. Alicia had betrayed me, yes, but now I was living with the consequences of that betrayal just as much as she was. One evening, after another silent dinner, she finally broke. We were sitting across from each other, picking at our food in silence, when she looked up at me, her face etched with despair. "John," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I don't know how much longer I can go on like this." I didn't respond, just stared back at her, holding her gaze. She took a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the table. "I know I ruined everything," she continued, her voice barely a whisper. "I know I don't deserve anything from you. But I can't live in this house, in this silence, not like this. I'm not strong enough." The anger that had fueled me for so long flared up again, but it was weaker now, dimmed by the exhaustion of keeping up the act. I didn't want to hear her confessions, her apologies. I'd hardened myself to all of it, refusing to let her words pierce through the walls I'd built around my heart. But as I looked at her, really looked at her, I saw the depth of her regret, the sorrow in her eyes, and I felt a flicker of something unexpected, a pang of pity. "What do you want me to say, Alicia?" I asked finally, my voice low. "You're the one who chose this. You're the one who destroyed everything we had." She nodded, tears filling her eyes. "I know. I know, John. And I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I just wanted to tell you that I'm sorry. I never realized how much I would lose until it was already gone." A heavy silence settled between us, thick with the weight of unspoken words. For the first time, I saw her pain as something real, something beyond the superficial guilt I'd assumed she felt. She was truly suffering, just as I was, caught in a web of consequences that neither of us could escape. In that moment, a part of me wanted to reach across the table, to hold her hand, to let her know that maybe, just maybe, there was a glimmer of hope left. But before I could decide, she pushed her chair back, wiping away a tear. "I think it's best if I leave," she said, her voice barely audible. "I'll stay with my sister for a while, give us both some space." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Part of me was relieved, glad to finally be rid of the constant reminder of her betrayal. But as she gathered a few of her things and walked to the door, a strange heaviness settled over me, a sense of finality that I hadn't anticipated. When the door clicked shut behind her, the silence was deafening, a void that seemed to swallow up the house. Days turned into weeks, and I fell into a routine of work, errands, and long, sleepless nights. The house felt emptier than I'd expected, the echoes of our life together haunting me with a quiet persistence. I'd expected to feel free, to enjoy the solitude, but instead, I found myself drowning in memories, in regrets that I couldn't shake. One night, I received a call from Alicia's sister, her voice thick with worry. "John," she said, her tone frantic. "I need to talk to you. It's about Alicia." I felt a cold sense of dread settle over me. "What's wrong?" I asked, my heart pounding. She's been struggling, John. Ever since she left, she hasn't been herself. I thought giving her space would help, that time would heal things, but she's not coping. I'm really worried about her. She won't talk to anyone, and she asked me to call you." A flood of emotions washed over me, guilt, anger, a flicker of something that felt almost like longing. I couldn't deny the urge to go to her, to see her, to somehow make sense of the mess we'd created. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her. I couldn't shake the feeling that, no matter how hard I tried to close the door on our marriage, there was something left unsaid, something unfinished. When I arrived at her sister's house, Alicia was sitting on the porch, her figure hunched over, her face pale and drawn. She looked up as I approached, her eyes hollow and tired. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The weight of our shared past hung heavy between us, a reminder of everything we'd lost. "Why did you ask me here?" I finally asked, my voice softer than I intended. She looked down, her fingers twisting together. I needed to see you, she whispered. I needed to know if there was any part of you that still cared. Even just a little. I felt a lump in my throat, the emotions I'd buried for so long clawing their way to the surface. I didn't have an answer, didn't know what to say. All I knew was that, despite everything, there was a part of me that still felt connected to her, a part that couldn't let go. We sat there in silence, the night stretching out around us, and for the first time, I allowed myself to feel the pain, to let the anger and resentment slip away. It was just the two of us, two broken people caught in the wreckage of our choices. When I finally looked at her, I saw the flicker of hope in her eyes, a glimmer of the woman I'd once loved. And in that moment, I realized that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for healing, a chance to rebuild something from the ashes. I reached for her hand, feeling the familiar warmth of her touch, and for the first time in months, I felt a fragile sense of peace. But that peace was short-lived. The next morning, I received a call. It was her sister, her voice shaking. John. Alicia, she's gone. The words hit me like a punch, my mind refusing to process them. What do you mean? I stammered, the world spinning around me. She left a note, her sister said, her voice thick with grief. She couldn't go on, John. She couldn't live with the guilt, the regret. She thought you'd be better off without her. I dropped the phone, the weight of her words crashing over me. I sank to the floor, the realization settling in, the reality of what I'd lost, what we'd both lost, becoming painfully clear. In my quest for revenge, in my need to make her feel my pain, I'd pushed her to the brink. And now she was gone. The emptiness that followed was unlike anything I'd ever known, a void that swallowed me whole. I'd thought I wanted her to suffer, to feel the consequences of her actions. But in the end, I'd only hurt myself, and in my blindness, I'd lost the only chance we might have had for healing. As I sat in the silent house that had once been our home, the walls closing in around me, I finally understood the true cost of betrayal, of vengeance. It wasn't just about the trust we'd lost or the pain we'd inflicted on each other. It was about the love we'd thrown away, the hope we'd shattered in our pride and anger. And now, with Alicia gone, I was left with nothing but memories, a lifetime of regrets, and the haunting realization that some wounds could never be healed.